There are places on this earth where the jungle does not simply grow, it reclaims, it buries, it holds secrets beneath a living shroud of green so thick that sunlight becomes a rumour, and what lies below remains invisible to the sky for 1,000 years or more. The Amazon basin stretches before us like an ocean of leaves, and beneath that canopy, beneath the howler monkeys and the cecropia trees and the endless drone of insects, something waits, something built, something vast, and for centuries we walk directly over it, never knowing what slept beneath our feet. Sit back, let the darkness settle around you. Tonight, we travel not across the surface of the world, but beneath it, in a manner of speaking. We move through the green curtain that has hidden entire civilizations from memory, through regions so remote that the very act of reaching them has claimed lives. We will stand, in spirit, among ruins that satellites could not see and that human eyes had not witnessed for 500 years. We will trace the outlines of cities that held more people than medieval London, roads that stretched farther than Rome's, and earthworks so precisely engineered that modern scholars struggle to explain their construction. And at each stop along our journey, we will find the same unsettling pattern: knowledge that appeared, flourished, and then vanished without explanation, leaving only silent stone and the faint impressions of something extraordinary. The Amazon was supposed to be empty. That was the story we told ourselves for generations. When the first Europeans pushed into the interior, following Francisco de Orellana down the river that would bear his name, they reported cities along the banks, dense populations, sophisticated agriculture. But when later expeditions arrived, they found only forest. The cities were gone. The people had vanished. And so a different narrative took hold. The Amazon, with its thin soils and punishing environment, could never have supported large populations. The jungle was primordial, untouched, a wilderness in the truest sense. Any reports of cities were dismissed as fever dreams, the hallucinations of men driven mad by heat and disease. For nearly 5 centuries that story held. It became so entrenched that when archaeologists began to find evidence of ancient settlement, their claims were met with skepticism. The Amazon was a green desert, incapable of sustaining civilization. Everyone knew this. It was settled science. And then the lasers came down from the sky. LIDAR, light detection and ranging, works by firing millions of laser pulses from aircraft, measuring the precise time each takes to return. Where traditional cameras see only the forest canopy, LIDAR penetrates. The laser pulses slip through gaps between leaves, strike the ground below, and return to their source. When processed, the data reveals not trees but terrain, not jungle but the shape of the earth itself. And when researchers first processed LIDAR data from the southern rim of the Amazon basin, in the region where Brazil meets Bolivia, they found something that rewrote history. Beneath the canopy lay cities, not villages, not scattered settlements. Cities connected by roads, surrounded by agricultural systems, organised into patterns that spoke of central planning and deliberate design. The scale was almost incomprehensible. In the Llanos de Moxos alone, that vast savanna wetland where Bolivia's lowlands meet the Amazon proper, the surveys revealed more than 1,000 forest islands, each one an artificial mound rising from the seasonal floods. Causeways stretched between them, elevated roads that allowed travel even when the waters rose. Canals crisscrossed the landscape, controlling water flow across an area larger than many European nations. And scattered throughout, arranged in patterns that seemed almost geometric, stood earthworks of extraordinary precision, ring ditches, platform mounds, and most puzzling of all, the spirals. Our journey begins here, in the Llanos de Moxos, where the dry season transforms wetlands into savanna and the wet season drowns the land beneath meters of water. It is a landscape of extremes, a place where survival itself demands adaptation. And yet someone, long ago, did not merely survive here. They reshaped the land itself, engineering a civilization across tens of thousands of square kilometers, building monuments that endured long after their makers had vanished into history. The spiral mounds rise from the floodplain like signatures written in earth. Seen from above, seen as only birds once saw them, and as satellites see them now, they curl inward upon themselves, some clockwise, some counter, their arms tapering to points, or broadening into platforms. The largest span more than 100 meters across. They were not formed by accident. They were not shaped by water or wind. They are deliberate constructions, each requiring the movement of thousands of cubic meters of soil, each positioned with care across a landscape that floods for half of every year. Mainstream archaeology interprets these mounds as ceremonial structures, perhaps burial sites, perhaps gathering places for communities scattered across the wetlands. The Moxos culture, as scholars have come to call it, flourished here between roughly 400 and 1400 CE, developing sophisticated strategies for living with the floods rather than against them. The forest islands were agricultural plots raised above high water marks. The causeways were transportation networks. The canals were fish weirs and irrigation channels. It is an elegant explanation, one that credits the ancient inhabitants with remarkable environmental engineering while fitting neatly within conventional frameworks of pre-Columbian development. Yet certain aspects of the spiral mounds continue to invite deeper reflection. The precision of their geometry, for one. These are not rough earthworks thrown together by hand. The spirals maintain consistent proportions across the landscape, their curves smooth, their dimensions regular. How was such uniformity achieved across distances of dozens of kilometers, in an environment where seasonal flooding would have limited the construction window to a few months each year? The labor required was immense, the coordination extraordinary, and the purpose remains unclear. If these were burial mounds, why the spiral form? If ceremonial spaces, why construct them in locations that would flood annually, making access difficult for much of the year? More puzzling still is their orientation. When mapped, the spiral mounds show patterns that some researchers have suggested align with celestial events: solstices, equinoxes, the rising points of certain stars. Such alignments have been found in monuments around the world, from Stonehenge to the pyramids of Giza, but they require sophisticated astronomical observation and the ability to translate that knowledge into physical construction. The builders of the Moxos earthworks left no written records, no astronomical tables, no architectural drawings. Whatever knowledge guided their work exists now only in the mounds themselves, silent witnesses to intentions we can no longer read. And then there is the vanishing. Around 1400 CE, construction ceased. The elaborate water management systems fell into disrepair. The forest islands were abandoned to the encroaching vegetation. Within a few generations, the jungle had begun its slow work of reclamation, and within a few centuries, even the memory of what had existed here would fade. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they found scattered indigenous communities, but nothing that resembled the civilization whose traces lay hidden beneath the green. What happened? Disease, brought by European contact, is the most commonly cited explanation, and it is almost certainly part of the truth. But the timeline troubles some researchers. The decline appears to have begun before European arrival, before the plagues that would devastate populations across the Americas. Something else was happening here, some process we do not fully understand, some abandonment that preceded the catastrophe to come. Standing at the edge of one of these spiral mounds, watching the floodwaters recede with the dry season, one cannot help but feel the weight of absence. The people who built this are gone. The purpose they served is gone. Even the knowledge of their existence was nearly gone, buried beneath centuries of growth and the persistent myth of an empty Amazon. What remains is earth shaped by intention, a signature in the landscape that outlasted everything else. The spiral curves inward, and at its centre there is only silence. Our journey carries us northward now, following the contours of the Amazon basin as it narrows toward the Andes, then sweeping east and north into a different landscape, a different canopy, a different set of secrets. We leave the wetlands of Bolivia behind and enter the realm of terra firma, the upland forests of the southern Amazon, where the ground does not flood and the soil was long believed too poor to support intensive agriculture. Here too, lidar has revealed what centuries of exploration missed. Here too, cities waited beneath the trees. The discoveries began in earnest in the early 2020s, when surveys of the Upper Tapajos Basin revealed a network of settlements stretching across hundreds of square kilometers. The sites were arranged in clusters, each cluster organized around a central plaza, each plaza surrounded by circular earthworks that may have served as defensive fortifications or ceremonial enclosures. Roads connected the clusters, Straight lines cut through the forest with a directness that spoke of planning rather than organic growth. The scale was startling. Population estimates for some clusters ran into the tens of thousands. The total population of the network may have exceeded 1 million people at its height. 1 million people in the Amazon. In a region that textbooks still described as a counterfeit paradise, incapable of supporting dense settlement, the discovery did not merely add a chapter to the history of pre-Columbian America. It suggested that entire volumes had been missing. Mainstream interpretation frames these settlements as the work of the Tapajos culture, one of several complex societies that developed along the Amazon's major tributaries between 1000 and 1500 CE. These peoples mastered the creation of terra preta, dark earth, a deliberately enriched soil that transforms the Amazon's naturally poor laterite into some of the most fertile ground on the planet. The technique involved the systematic incorporation of charcoal, organic waste, pottery shards, and bone into the soil, a process that not only improved fertility, but created a self-sustaining microbial community that maintained soil quality for centuries. Terra preta sites dot the Amazon basin, their dark colour visible even today against the reddish background of natural soil. They are found near river bluffs, around ancient settlements, and, according to some estimates, may cover as much as 10% of the Amazon basin, an area larger than France created by human hands. Yet the how of terra preta remains incompletely understood. Modern attempts to recreate the soil have met with mixed success. The precise combination of materials, the temperatures required for proper charcoal production, the microbial communities that must be cultivated, these details were not recorded by the makers. They knew, through whatever process of experimentation or transmission, how to perform this alchemy. And then, like so much else, the knowledge vanished. When the populations collapsed, the technique was lost. The soil they created remains, still fertile after 500 years, but the method of its creation had to be rediscovered by modern science, laboriously, incompletely. How does knowledge so valuable simply disappear? The question echoes through every site we will visit tonight. Societies sophisticated enough to reshape landscapes, to engineer environments, to coordinate labour across vast distances. These were not primitive peoples scratching at the edge of survival. They possessed understanding that we are only now beginning to recover. And yet that understanding passed from the world so completely that we forgot it had ever existed. The LIDAR surveys of the Upper Tapajos revealed another troubling detail. Many of the sites showed evidence of deliberate abandonment. Houses were dismantled in orderly fashion, materials removed, the ground cleared. This was not the pattern of sudden collapse, of plague sweeping through a population too quickly for organised response. This was withdrawal, planned departure, people leaving for reasons that remain unclear, taking what they could, leaving behind only the shapes of what they had built. Some researchers have suggested environmental factors, drought, soil exhaustion, shifts in rainfall patterns. Others point to social upheaval, warfare, the fragmentation of political systems that had grown too large to sustain. But no single explanation fits all the evidence, and the silence of the abandoned plazas offers no answers. Deeper into the basin we go, our journey now turning westward, toward the borders where Brazil meets Peru and Colombia, toward the most recent and perhaps most startling of the Amazon's revealed cities. In 2024, researchers published findings from LIDAR surveys of the Upano Valley in Ecuador, on the eastern slopes of the Andes. What they found challenged not only the scale of Amazonian settlement, but its antiquity. The Upano sites date to between 500 BCE and 300 CE, more than 1,000 years older than the Tapajos settlements, contemporary with the rise of Rome, with the unification of China under the Qin, with the flourishing of classical Greece. And they were not small. The surveys revealed a network of interconnected settlements covering more than 300 square kilometres, with wide roads, central plazas, and a population that may have reached tens of thousands. This was not a late development, not a brief florescence before collapse. This was a civilization that endured for nearly a millennium, building, expanding, engineering its landscape with a sophistication that rivals anything found in the pre-Columbian Americas. The Upano people terraced their hillsides, carving flat platforms from the steep Andean slopes. They constructed canals and drainage systems to manage the region's heavy rainfall. They built earthen pyramids, platform mounds that rose in steps above the surrounding terrain, oriented to cardinal directions, positioned with care along sight lines that connected settlement to settlement. The largest of these mounds would have dominated the landscape, visible from kilometers away, monuments to whatever gods or ancestors or cosmic principles the builders served. And like everywhere else in this green realm, they vanished. Around 300 CE, the Upano sites were abandoned. The roads fell silent. The terraces began their slow return to jungle, and for 2,000 years the forest held its secret, until lasers fired from the sky revealed what had been hidden all along. We leave the Amazon now, though its shadow follows us, that same pattern of burial and revelation, of knowledge lost and landscapes reclaimed. Our path turns northward, crossing the invisible line where South America becomes central, entering the wet lowlands of the Petén, Guatemala's northern department, a region of limestone karst and seasonal wetlands, and beneath the mahogany and ceiba trees, one of the greatest concentrations of ancient cities on Earth. The Maya did not hide. Their pyramids rise above the canopy at Tikal and Calakmul, at El Mirador and Nakum, stone monuments too tall for even the tallest trees to swallow completely. For more than a century, archaeologists have excavated these sites, mapping temples and palaces, deciphering hieroglyphic inscriptions, reconstructing a civilization that flourished for 2 millennia before its collapse in the 9th century. The Maya are not forgotten. Their descendants number in the millions, speaking languages that descend directly from the tongues of pyramid builders, maintaining traditions that stretch back beyond memory. And yet the Petén holds secrets still. LIDAR surveys conducted since 2016 have revealed that the known sites, the famous temples, the excavated cities, represent only a fraction of what the Maya built. Between the great centres, obscured by jungle growth, lie thousands of structures that no archaeologist has ever mapped on the ground. Causeways connect settlement to settlement, some stretching more than 40 kilometres through terrain so difficult that modern explorers struggle to traverse it. Defensive walls and ditches suggest a landscape organised for warfare, with fortified boundaries dividing the lowlands into territories. Agricultural terraces and irrigation systems indicate populations far larger than previous estimates. Perhaps 10 million people living in the Petén lowlands at the classic Maya peak, a density comparable to some of the most crowded regions of medieval Europe. 10 million people, in a landscape conventionally described as challenging, marginal, poorly suited to intensive agriculture. The Maya, it seems, solved problems we did not know they faced, feeding multitudes where we assumed only scattered populations could survive. The unmapped pyramids rise in clusters, some modest, some rivaling the known monuments of Tikal. They are everywhere, or so the LIDAR suggests. Ground-truthing expeditions have confirmed many of the signatures, finding stone structures beneath the vegetation, walls still standing after 12 centuries of abandonment. But the jungle makes access difficult. Many sites remain unvisited, their shapes known only from the laser data, their surfaces untouched by modern hands. What sleeps in those unexcavated mounds? What inscriptions remain to be read? What burials to be found? What knowledge to be recovered? The Petén is not an empty wilderness. It is an archive, vast and largely unread, its contents waiting beneath the leaves. Our journey pauses now at a site that bridges the mapped and the unmapped, the famous and the forgotten. Yaxchilan rises along the banks of the Usumacinta River, on the border between Mexico and Guatemala, its temples climbing the steep slopes above the water. It is not unknown. Tourists visit, archaeologists have studied it for decades, its hieroglyphic lintels hang in museums around the world. But Yaxchilan holds complexities that resist easy interpretation, passages that lead into darkness, structures whose purposes remain unclear. The labyrinth begins beneath the main plaza. A passage descends into the limestone, its walls carved with glyphs that have never been fully deciphered. The tunnel branches, turns, descends again. Chambers open off the main passage, some containing altars, some empty, some showing signs of ancient fire. The conventional interpretation is straightforward. These are ritual spaces, the Maya underworld made manifest, a physical representation of Xibalba, the realm of death through which mythological heroes journeyed. The tunnels served religious purposes, initiatory purposes, connecting the world of the living with the world below. Yet the extent of the labyrinth troubles some researchers. Passages continue beyond the mapped areas, blocked by collapse or simply unexplored. How far do they run? What lies at their termination? And why here, at Yaxchilan, would the Maya construct an underground network more extensive than at any other known site? Local legends speak of tunnels that cross beneath the river, connecting Yaxchilan with sites on the Guatemalan bank. Archaeologists have found no evidence for such passages, but the legends persist, passed down through generations of communities that have lived along the Usumacinta for centuries. Are these merely stories, the kind of mythologizing that attaches to ancient places everywhere? Or do they preserve some memory of knowledge now lost, of passages we have not yet found? Standing at the entrance to the labyrinth, the air cool and damp against the skin, one feels the weight of the stone above, the darkness ahead, the uncertainty of what lies beyond the torchlight's reach. The Maya built this. They descended into this darkness, performed rituals whose meaning we can only partially reconstruct, emerged again into the light of the surface world. The passage remains, but the knowledge of its full purpose, its full extent, its full significance, that passed from the world when the last priest departed, when the last ceremonies were performed, when the jungle began its slow embrace. We continue northward, crossing from the Maya lowlands into a different realm, a different canopy, a different set of mysteries. The Mosquitia awaits, the eastern lowlands of Honduras, a region so remote that even today, large portions remain inaccessible to anything but helicopter. Here, the jungle is not merely an obstacle, it is a presence, a force that has resisted human incursion for as long as records exist. And beneath its cover, according to legends that stretch back to the earlier Spanish accounts, lies a city of white stone, a place of wealth and power, a place that those who enter do not leave. The legend of La Ciudad Blanca, the White City, has circulated for 5 centuries. Hernán Cortés mentioned rumours of it in letters to the Spanish crown. Later explorers claimed to have seen its walls from distant ridges, gleaming in the jungle light. Indigenous peoples spoke of a forbidden place, cursed, protected by spirits that punished trespassers with disease and death. Expeditions mounted throughout the 20th century returned with tantalizing hints. A carved stone here, a pottery shard there, but no definitive location, no undeniable proof. In 2012, LIDAR changed everything. A survey of a remote valley in the Mosquitia revealed what appeared to be a major settlement. Plazas, mounds, pyramids, earthworks arranged in patterns that spoke of intentional design. The site had never been recorded by archaeologists. It did not appear on any map, and the features detected by the laser were consistent with the legends. A significant urban centre, hidden beneath the canopy, untouched since its abandonment. The expedition that followed in 2015 confirmed the LIDAR findings. The city was real. Its structures emerged from the jungle growth exactly where the data predicted. Stone sculptures lay where they had fallen, half buried in leaf litter, their forms still discernible after centuries of exposure. The team found a cache of objects at the base of a pyramid. Stone vessels, carved figures, objects that suggested ceremonial use. They documented what they could, photographed the visible structures, and withdrew. And then the trouble began. Within weeks of the expedition's return, several team members fell ill. The symptoms were severe: fever, joint pain, facial disfigurement. The diagnosis was leishmaniasis, a parasitic disease transmitted by sandfly bites, endemic to the region but rarely seen in such acute form. One team member required extensive surgery to repair damage to his face. Another nearly lost his arm. The disease, it seemed, had been waiting for them in the jungle, a guardian more effective than any curse. The reaction was immediate and widespread. Commentators noted the eerie parallel to the legends, the white city that punished those who entered, the curse that fell upon trespassers. Mainstream medicine explained the outbreak in prosaic terms. The Mosquitia harbours endemic diseases. Proper precautions were not taken. Exposure was inevitable given the conditions. There was no curse, there was only biology, indifferent and brutal. Yet the coincidence lingered. For 5 centuries, legends had warned of this place. For 5 centuries, the city had remained hidden, its location unknown, its treasures untouched. And when at last explorers breached its perimeter, documented its existence, laid hands upon its artifacts, they returned marked, scarred, their faces permanently altered by the jungle's response. What protection did the original inhabitants possess? The city was occupied for centuries, perhaps millennia. People lived here, worked here, raised children and buried their dead. They did not fall to the parasites. They coexisted with the jungle's dangers in ways that modern medicine, with all its antibiotics and antiparasitics, could not replicate. What knowledge allowed them to survive where we fell ill? And when they left, when they abandoned the white stones to the encroaching green, did that knowledge leave with them another technique lost to history, another secret the jungle reclaimed? The White City remains largely unexplored. Further expeditions have been planned and delayed, the risks weighing against the archaeological rewards. The jungle has resumed its work, the vegetation growing thicker each year, the stone features slowly disappearing beneath new growth. In another century, perhaps two, even the lidar signatures may become ambiguous, the city sinking back into the formlessness from which it briefly emerged. Our journey has carried us through several layers of revelation now, the spiral mounds of Bolivia, the revealed cities of the Amazon, the unmapped pyramids of the Petén, the labyrinth of Yaxchilan, the cursed stones of the Mosquitia. At each site, we have found the same troubling pattern. Civilizations arose in places we believed uninhabitable. They engineered landscapes on scales we struggle to comprehend. They possessed knowledge of soil, of water, of stone, of survival, that we are only beginning to recover. And then they vanished, leaving behind monuments that the jungle worked to swallow, traces that satellites could not see, secrets that waited beneath the canopy for centuries. Why do we keep finding these places? The cynical answer is technology. LIDAR reveals what eyes cannot see, and as the surveys expand, more sites emerge. But that answer only pushes the question back a step. Why were the sites hidden in the first place? Why did the jungle reclaim them so completely, so quickly, that even a century of air travel and satellite imaging failed to reveal their extent? Part of the answer lies in the nature of tropical forest growth. In temperate climates, abandoned buildings may stand for centuries, their stone walls resisting the slow creep of vegetation. In the tropics, the process is faster by orders of magnitude. Trees send roots through cracks in masonry. Vines pull at carved stones. Organic matter accumulates, forming soil that buries lower courses. Within a few decades of abandonment, a stone pyramid can be reduced to an ambiguous mound, indistinguishable from natural formations. Within a few centuries, it can vanish entirely beneath the green, its shape preserved only in the contours of the forest floor. But there is another part of the answer, one that sits less comfortably with modern assumptions. The jungle reclaimed these places because we did not believe they existed. For 5 centuries, the dominant narrative insisted that the Amazon was empty, that the Maya lowlands were marginal, that the Mosquitia was trackless wilderness. And because we believed this, we did not look. We walked over buried cities without suspecting their presence. We flew over pyramids without seeing their shapes. We built theories of human history that had no room for the civilizations sleeping beneath our feet. The LIDAR revelations are humbling not merely because they expand the past, but because they expose the limits of our assumptions. We did not find these places for 500 years because we were certain they could not exist. What else have we missed? What other certainties will dissolve when new technologies, new perspectives, new willingness to question reveal what has been waiting all along? The spiral mounds curl inward upon themselves, their centres silent. The Amazonian cities lie empty, their plazas long unwalked. The Petén pyramids rise beneath their shrouds of green, their inscriptions unread. The labyrinth of Yaxchilan descends into darkness, its passages unexplored. The White City guards its secrets, its curse, if curse it be, still potent after all these years. These are not dead places, they are waiting places. The jungle holds them in a kind of suspended animation, preserving their forms even as it obscures them, maintaining the shape of what was even as it erases the memory. And now, slowly, piece by piece, survey by survey, we are beginning to see them again. We are beginning to remember what we had forgotten, or what perhaps we had never truly known. The canopy stretches before us, an ocean of green hiding depths we are only beginning to fathom. and our journey has only begun. The night falls differently in the tropics. There is no lingering twilight, no gradual softening of the sky. One moment the sun hangs above the canopy, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The next, darkness arrives like a curtain drawn, complete and sudden, carrying with it the chorus of creatures that claim the hours between dusk and dawn. In that darkness, the hidden cities seem to breathe. The mounds settle into the earth. The pyramids lose their edges, becoming shapes felt rather than seen. The rivers continue their patient work, carrying sediment toward distant seas, indifferent to the ruins they pass, the plazas they once bordered, the causeways they once fed. And in that darkness, questions multiply. They emerge from the spaces between what we know and what we assume, from the gaps in the record, from the silences that no inscription can fill. We have traced the outlines of lost worlds, glimpsed their scale through the penetrating eyes of airborne lasers. But outlines are not understanding. Scale is not explanation. The deeper we look, the more we realize how much remains beyond our reach. Consider what it meant to live in these places. Not as abstract historical actors, not as populations measured in labor hours and caloric outputs, but as human beings who woke each morning to birdsong and mist, who walked paths worn smooth by generations of feet, who looked upon the same stars that now shine down upon the ruins of their works. What did they believe about the world? What stories did they tell their children as darkness fell? What hopes drove them to move stones that weighed more than any individual could lift, to dig canals that stretched beyond the horizon, to shape the living landscape into forms that would outlast their names? These are questions that archaeology cannot fully answer. The material record preserves walls and tools, burials and broken pottery, but it does not preserve the inner life, the dreams and fears that animated the builders. We can reconstruct their diets from residue on cooking vessels, their trade networks from the distribution of exotic goods, their social hierarchies from the size and placement of their dwellings. But we cannot reconstruct the moment when a worker paused atop a half-built mound and looked out across the savannah, wondering if the task would ever be complete. We cannot know the conversations that took place in the plazas now buried beneath centuries of leaf fall, the arguments and alliances, the loves and grievances that shaped communities as surely as any engineering project. What we can know is that they were here. They were present in these places we believed empty, active, in these landscapes we dismissed as wilderness, building futures they could not have known would be cut short. And that presence, that activity, that building, these leave traces that persist even when memory fails, even when the canopy closes overhead, even when 5 centuries of misunderstanding insist that such things were impossible. The Llanos de Moxos hold some of the most extensive traces of all. We have spoken of the spiral mounds, those mysterious formations that curl across the savannah like the shells of ancient creatures pressed into the earth. But the mounds are only part of the story. The landscape itself was engineered on a scale that defies easy comprehension. Raised fields cover thousands of square kilometers, their outlines visible from above as geometric patterns imposed upon the wetland. Causeways link settlements separated by distances that would have taken days to walk through unimproved terrain. Reservoirs and canals manage water across a region that alternates between flood and drought with each passing season. The mainstream archaeological interpretation identifies these features as the work of pre-Columbian societies, adapting to a challenging environment. The raised fields lifted crops above floodwaters, creating agricultural surfaces that remained productive even when the surrounding land drowned beneath seasonal rains. The canals channeled water during droughts, maintaining flow to settlements and fields when natural streams ran dry. The causeways facilitated movement and trade, linking communities into networks that spanned hundreds of kilometers. This interpretation is almost certainly correct. The engineering served practical purposes, addressing real challenges posed by a landscape that offered abundance and adversity in equal measure. Yet the scale of the engineering suggests something beyond mere practicality. Estimates of the labour required to construct these features run into millions of person days. The coordination necessary to plan and execute work spanning such vast areas implies social organisation of considerable sophistication. The maintenance required to keep the system functioning across generations implies institutional continuity that rivals anything known from the ancient world. Were these works merely agricultural infrastructure, or did they serve other purposes as well? Were the geometric patterns purely functional, or did they carry meanings that elude our utilitarian frameworks? When the builders looked out across fields raised and canals dug, did they see farms, or did they see something more? A statement of presence, a claim upon the land, a message intended for eyes that might not exist for centuries? The spiral mounds suggest the latter possibility. Their precise function remains uncertain despite decades of study. Some served as burial sites, their centres yielding ceramic vessels and human remains. Others appear residential, their surfaces supporting structures of perishable materials long since rotted away. Still others seem to have served ceremonial purposes, their forms oriented toward astronomical phenomena, their shapes echoing motifs found in pottery and textiles. But why spirals? Why this particular form, repeated across hundreds of kilometres, consistent in its basic geometry, even as details varied from site to site? One possibility is that the spiral held cosmological significance, encoding beliefs about the structure of reality, the relationship between earth and sky, the passage of time and the cycles of existence. Many indigenous Amazonian traditions feature spiral motifs, often associated with water, with serpents, with the movement of life through successive stages of being. The mound builders may have shared related beliefs, expressing them in earth as others expressed them in myth and ritual. If so, the mounds were not merely infrastructure but inscriptions upon the landscape, texts written in a language of form that we're only beginning to learn to read. Another possibility is that the spiral form served practical purposes we have not yet identified. The coiled shape may have enhanced drainage, channeling water away from central areas during floods. It may have created microclimates, the raised earth warming differently than surrounding wetlands, extending growing seasons or supporting crops that required specific conditions. It may have facilitated defence, the narrow access points easier to guard than open settlements. Or it may have accomplished all these things simultaneously, its form optimised through generations of trial and error to serve multiple functions at once. The truth, if truth can be recovered from such fragmentary evidence, likely lies somewhere between these possibilities. The mounds were practical and symbolic, functional and meaningful, infrastructure and inscription. They were expressions of a worldview in which such distinctions held less force than they do in modern thought, in which shaping the land was simultaneously shaping society, shaping belief, shaping the relationship between the human and the more than human. To build was to declare, to maintain was to remember, to inhabit was to participate in something larger than any individual life, larger perhaps than any single generation. This integration of the practical and the symbolic appears again and again across the sites we have visited. The Amazonian cities, with their precisely oriented streets and plazas, suggest urban planning that incorporated astronomical alignments, solstices and equinoxes marked by the play of light and shadow on public spaces. The Peten pyramids, even those not yet excavated, show orientations that point towards specific celestial events. Their builders attuned to cycles of sky as much as cycles of rain and drought. Yaxchilan's labyrinth descends into darkness that may have represented the underworld, its passages echoing beliefs about death and transformation that pervaded Maya thought. The White City, whatever its true nature, sits in a landscape layered with meaning, its rivers and mountains carrying names and stories that predate Spanish contact by unknown spans of time. To understand these places, we must try to recover the worldviews that shaped them. We must set aside, at least temporarily, the categories that structure modern thought, the division between nature and culture, between practical and sacred, between the material world and the world of meaning. For the builders of these places, such divisions may have made little sense. The land was alive with presence, the stones remembered. The water carried messages, the sky spoke in a language of movement and light. To build was to converse with these presences, to negotiate with them, to participate in relationships that bound human communities to the larger cosmos. This is not mysticism, it is anthropology, the recognition that different human societies have understood reality in different ways, organised experience through different frameworks, lived in worlds structured by different assumptions. The builders of the spiral mounds inhabited a world different from ours. Their engineering achievements were expressions of that different world, shaped by beliefs and values that we can only partially reconstruct. To dismiss those beliefs as primitive or superstitious is to miss the point entirely. They built what they built. Their works have survived for centuries, outlasting the colonial structures that replaced them, persisting beneath canopies that buried even the memory of their existence. Whatever they believed, they were effective. Whatever their worldview, it produced results that still astonish. The flooding season arrives in the Llanos de Moxos sometime around November. Waters rise across the savanna, filling depressions, overtopping banks, transforming the landscape into an inland sea broken only by the raised surfaces of mounds and causeways. Fish multiply in the suddenly expanded waterways. Birds gather by the millions, feeding on the abundance. The air thickens with moisture and life, and beneath the waters the raised fields wait, their surfaces prepared for the crops that will be planted when the floods recede. This seasonal rhythm has continued for thousands of years, long before humans arrived to reshape the land, long after the mound builders vanished from the historical record. The ecosystem adapted to the floods, evolving to exploit the annual pulse of water that transformed the landscape. And the human inhabitants adapted as well, their engineering working with the rhythm rather than against it, amplifying the productive potential of a cycle that would continue regardless of human intervention. They did not conquer the landscape, they collaborated with it, learned its patterns, fitted their works into its flow. The raised fields floated above the floods like islands, their surfaces remaining dry even as the surrounding land drowned. The fish weirs channeled the abundance of the flood season, concentrating protein for communities that might otherwise have struggled to survive. The causeways maintained connections when all other routes disappeared beneath the water, linking settlements that would otherwise have been isolated for months at a time. This collaboration extended beyond mere engineering. The management of fire, the selection of useful species, the encouragement of forest groves on otherwise treeless savanna, all of these practices shaped the ecosystem in ways that enhanced its productivity for human purposes. The landscape that existed when the first Europeans arrived was not pristine wilderness, but an artifact of human activity stretching back millennia, a garden grown wild in the centuries since its gardeners disappeared. The trees that seemed natural were often planted. The open areas that seemed uncultivated were often maintained by burning. The apparent emptiness was actually a very particular kind of fullness, shaped by intentions and practices that left no written record but inscribed themselves upon the land itself. We are only beginning to understand the extent of this shaping. Archaeological surveys reveal new sites with each passing season. Soil analyses detect the signatures of human activity in places that seemed untouched. Ecological studies identify plant communities that bear the marks of ancient management. The landscape itself becomes a text, written over millennia, partially erased by abandonment and colonial disruption, now slowly being read by those with eyes to see and methods to detect what remains. But reading is not the same as understanding. We can identify the raised fields, measure their dimensions, map their distribution. We can excavate the mounds, catalogue their contents, date their construction. We can reconstruct the broad outlines of settlement patterns, population densities, trade networks. What we cannot do, not yet, perhaps not ever, is recover the full meaning of what we find. The builders left no written records that have survived. Their descendants, when they can be identified, often live far from the lands their ancestors inhabited, their traditions disrupted by centuries of colonization and displacement. The knowledge that animated the building, the beliefs that gave it meaning, the stories that made sense of the work, these have largely vanished, surviving only in fragments, hints, suggestions that tantalize without satisfying. Perhaps this is appropriate. Perhaps some things should remain mysterious, should resist the modern impulse to explain and categorize and contain. The spiral mounds curl inward upon themselves, guarding centers that may never yield their full significance. The raised fields grid the landscape, their geometry speaking a language we only partially comprehend. The causeways stretch toward horizons, connecting places whose relationships we can trace, but not fully understand. The land remembers what the documents do not record, holds what the archives cannot contain. And in that holding, something persists that transcends our categories, that refuses to be reduced to data points and interpretive frameworks. Standing at the edge of a mound during the dry season, when the grasses turn golden and the wind carries the smell of dust and distance, one feels the weight of that persistence. The earth rises beneath your feet, shaped by hands that moved centuries ago, maintained by communities that have long since dispersed. The curve of the spiral leads your eye inward, toward a centre that is both physical and symbolic, a point of convergence that may once have held meaning now lost. Around you, the savannah stretches to the horizon, flat and vast, broken only by the geometric irregularities that mark human presence upon the land. And above, the sky arcs blue and bottomless, the same sky that the builders saw, the same sun that warmed their labour, the same clouds that brought the rains that made their engineering necessary and possible. What did they think, those builders, when they looked up at that sky? What prayers did they offer? What hopes did they hold? What fears haunted their nights? We cannot know. The documents do not tell us. The archaeology cannot recover it. The landscape holds its secrets, reveals its shapes but not its meanings, offers evidence without interpretation. And perhaps that is the final lesson of these places, the uncomfortable truth that our journey reveals. We are not entitled to all the answers. Some knowledge belongs to those who made it, who lived it, who carried it with them when they passed from the world. We are visitors here, latecomers to a conversation that began long before us, recipients of a legacy we did not earn and cannot fully appreciate. The best we can do is approach with humility, with wonder, with the recognition that our understanding will always be partial, our interpretations always provisional, our conclusions always subject to revision as new evidence emerges and new perspectives develop. The waters will rise again in the Llanos de Moxos. The seasonal floods will return, as they have returned for millennia, transforming the savannah into a shallow sea. The raised fields will stand above the water as they have stood since they were first built. The mounds will persist, their spirals curving through whatever futures await. And the questions will remain, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, waiting for seekers patient enough to sit with uncertainty, to accept that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but only to be contemplated. Our journey continues, carrying us now northward once again, across the shifting border between savanna and forest, toward places where the canopy closes overhead and the understory thickens into shadow. The Mosquitia awaits, with its cursed stones and its fatal fevers, its hidden plazas and its unexplored ruins. We have spoken of the White City, glimpsed its outlines through the LIDAR data, noted the strange fate of those who entered its precincts. But the Mosquitia holds more than a single site, more than a single mystery. It holds a landscape of secrets, a region so vast and so difficult to traverse that significant portions remain unsurveyed even now, their contents unknown, their histories unwritten. The rivers there run brown with sediment, their banks lined with trees that lean over the water as if reaching for something on the other side. Jaguars move through the undergrowth, their spotted coats flickering between patches of light and shadow. Verdilants coil in the leaf litter, their venom capable of killing in hours, their camouflage so effective that a walker may pass within inches without seeing the danger. And beneath the trees, beneath the snakes, beneath the accumulated debris of centuries of growth and decay, the ruins wait. Platforms and plazas, carved stones and earthen mounds, the traces of a civilization that flourished while Europe languished in its medieval night, that built cities in the forest, that maintained trade networks spanning hundreds of kilometers, that created art and architecture and agricultural systems that we are only beginning to rediscover. The mainstream interpretation places the Mosquitian sites within the broader context of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican and Caribbean development. Trade connections linked the region to the Maya to the northwest, to the Chibchan cultures to the southeast, to coastal peoples who moved goods by water along the Caribbean littoral. The sculptures found at the White City and related sites show stylistic affinities with traditions to the north and south, suggesting cultural exchange, shared iconographic vocabularies, perhaps even common ritual practices. The engineering, the terraces, the drainage systems, the modified slopes, reflects sophisticated understanding of tropical hydrology, the kind of knowledge that develops over generations of living in and working with a challenging environment. Yet the scale of the Mosquitian sites continues to surprise. Each new survey reveals more than expected. Each excavation, however limited, produces artifacts that suggest denser occupation, more complex social organisation, more extensive trade than previous estimates allowed. The cities beneath the canopy were not marginal outposts on the edge of the civilized world. They were centers in their own right, nodes in networks that spanned vast distances, populations numbered not in hundreds, but in thousands or tens of thousands. They built in stone when they could obtain it, in earth when they could not. They carved monuments that depicted rulers and deities, historical events and mythological narratives. They maintained the forest even as they modified it, cultivating useful species, managing the ecological balance that sustained their numbers, and then they disappeared. Not all at once, not in a single catastrophic collapse, but gradually, across decades, or perhaps centuries. The cities emptied, the plazas fell silent, the monuments tilted and toppled, and the forest, patient and relentless, began its long work of reclamation, covering in green what had once stood in the open, burying in soil what had once risen toward the sky. By the time the Spanish arrived, the Mosquitia was already deep into its forgetting. The people who remained lived in scattered communities, their connection to the ruins uncertain, their knowledge of the builders fragmentary at best. The colonizers saw wilderness where cities had stood. They saw emptiness where thousands had lived. They saw primitiveness where sophistication had flourished. This misperception persisted for centuries. It shaped policy and practice, justified exploitation and dispossession, underwrote narratives that denied indigenous peoples their history, even as it robbed them of their lands. The jungle was empty because we said it was empty. The ruins did not exist because we could not see them, would not see them, refused to see them, even when the evidence lay literally beneath our feet. The White City became legend precisely because acknowledgement of its existence would have required revising assumptions too deeply held to question. And so the forest kept its secrets, holding them close as a miser holds coins, releasing them only when technology finally developed eyes capable of seeing through the green. Lidar did not discover the White City. It revealed what had never been lost, only hidden, waiting beneath the canopy for someone to look properly. The laser pulses that penetrated the leaves and mapped the ground below did not create the terraces and plazas. They merely confirmed what the indigenous peoples of the region had always known, what the legends had always insisted, what the landscape itself had been whispering to anyone willing to listen. There are cities in the forest. There have always been cities in the forest. We simply chose not to hear. Our journey shifts now, moving southward and westward, away from the humid lowlands of Mosquitia and toward another landscape where the forest guards its own. The Petén lowlands of northern Guatemala stretch across the base of the Yucatan Peninsula, a vast expanse of tropical forest that spills across borders into Belize and Mexico. Here the Maya built their greatest cities, their most ambitious monuments, their most enduring legacy. Tikal rises from the green, its temples piercing the canopy like stone fingers pointing toward the sky. Calakmul sprawls across hectares of modified terrain, its twin pyramids visible for kilometers in every direction. El Mirador, older than either, contains structures of such massive scale that their construction required the coordination of thousands of workers over decades of sustained effort. These are the sites that appear in textbooks, that draw tourists by the hundreds of thousands, that have been excavated and studied and debated for over a century. Yet for every site we know, dozens remain unmapped, unexcavated, their pyramids rising beneath the trees as anonymous mounds, their plazas filled with centuries of fallen leaves. The Petén was not always forest, or rather, the forest was not always wild. During the classic Maya period, from roughly the 3rd century to the 9th century of the Common Era, the region supported populations numbering in the millions. The landscape was managed, cultivated, transformed. Reservoirs collected rainwater during the wet season and stored it for use during the dry months. Raised fields in seasonal wetlands extended the growing season, producing crops where unmodified land would have been too waterlogged to farm. Terraces carved into hillsides prevented erosion and created additional planting surfaces. Orchards of fruit and nut trees surrounded settlements, providing food and shade and material for tools and buildings. The forest was not cleared but integrated, its useful species encouraged, its resources harvested sustainably across generations. When the rains came, the reservoirs filled. When the dry season arrived, the stored water sustained the cities. The system worked for centuries, supporting one of the densest populations in the pre-industrial world outside of Asia, and then it failed. The terminal classic collapse, beginning around the 8th century and accelerating through the 9th, emptied the cities of the southern Maya lowlands. Tikal, which had housed perhaps 90,000 people at its peak, fell to a fraction of that number and eventually to abandonment. Calakmul, Tikal's great rival, followed a similar trajectory. Smaller sites simply vanished, their populations dispersing to the coasts, to the highlands, to anywhere that offered water and food and escape from whatever calamity was unfolding. Within a century or two, cities that had stood for half a millennium were empty. The plazas where kings had performed rituals and proclaimed victories fell silent. The temples where priests had tracked the movements of stars and calculated the cycles of time stood deserted. And the forest, ever patient, began its slow reconquest, sending roots into foundations, dropping seeds into courtyards, covering in green what had been built with such effort over so many generations. The mainstream interpretation of the Maya collapse points to a constellation of factors converging in the 8th and 9th centuries. Paleoclimate data suggests a series of severe droughts, the worst in 2,000 years, striking the region just as populations reached their peak. The reservoirs that had sustained the cities through normal dry seasons could not cope with years of reduced rainfall. Crops failed, water sources dried up, famine spread. At the same time, evidence suggests intensifying warfare among the major polities, conflicts that disrupted trade networks, diverted labour from food production to military campaigns, destabilised the political systems that had coordinated the management of land and water. Environmental degradation may have compounded these stresses. Deforestation for construction and fuel may have reduced rainfall and increased erosion. Soil exhaustion from intensive farming may have diminished yields even before the droughts arrived. The collapse was not a single event, but a cascade, each failure amplifying the others until the entire system broke down, yet questions persist. The droughts were severe, but earlier civilizations in the region had survived comparable dry periods. The warfare was intense, but the Maya had been fighting each other for centuries without abandoning their cities. The environmental damage was real, but the managed landscape had functioned sustainably for generations before the collapse. Why did the system fail when it did, rather than earlier or later? Why was the collapse so complete, so rapid, so total? Why did the survivors not return once the drains ended, once the political turmoil subsided, once the land had time to recover? The cities stood empty for centuries, their stones available for reuse, their plazas still level, their water system still intact. Yet no one came back, no one rebuilt, no one reclaimed what had been abandoned. The people simply left, and they did not return. The unmapped pyramids of the Peten number in the thousands. LIDAR surveys conducted over the past decade have revealed far more structures than anyone anticipated, suggesting that previous population estimates for the Maya lowlands may need to be revised upward dramatically. What we thought were gaps between cities may have been continuous zones of settlement. The landscape modified so extensively that the forest we see today is essentially regrowth over ancient farmland. The pyramids that rise beneath the canopy are not isolated monuments but elements of vast interconnected systems, their positions marking centres of population, their orientations marking astronomical events, their heights marking the ambitions of the rulers who ordered their construction. Some of these pyramids have never been climbed by modern researchers. Some have never been photographed. Some have names in indigenous languages that have never been recorded in any archive. They simply exist, silent witnesses to a past that we are only beginning to recover. The journey continues, following the Usumacinta River westward through the heart of the Maya world. The river flows brown and powerful through the lowlands, its waters swollen during the rainy season, its banks lined with forest that comes down to the water's edge. Travel here requires boats, the forest too dense for easy overland passage, the terrain too broken for roads. The Maya used this river as a highway, moving goods and people between cities that controlled different stretches of the waterway. Yaxchilan rose on a bend in the river, its temples and palaces climbing the slopes above the water, its inscriptions recording a history spanning centuries of rule. The site is accessible today only by boat, an hour's journey from the nearest road, the forest pressing close on all sides. Howler monkeys roar from the treetops, parrots flash green and red through the canopy. The humidity wraps around visitors like a damp blanket, the air so thick with moisture that sweat does not evaporate but simply accumulates. Yaxchilan was a power in its own right, ruling over a stretch of the river and the populations that lived along it. The inscriptions carved into its monuments record wars and alliances, marriages and successions, rituals performed to honour gods and ancestors. The kings of Yaxchilan claimed descent from divine beings, their lineages stretching back to mythological times, their authority derived from their connection to forces beyond the human world. The temples they built rose above the river, their facades carved with images of rulers and captives, gods and supernatural creatures. The plazas where they performed their rituals were designed to impress, to overawe, to reinforce the idea that the people who commanded such spaces were not ordinary humans but mediators between the earthly and the divine. But Yaxchilan holds secrets that go beyond its visible monuments. Beneath the temples carved into the limestone hills runs a network of passages and chambers whose full extent remains unknown. Some of these subterranean spaces were tombs, containing the remains of rulers and the offerings placed with them for the journey to the underworld. Some were ritual spaces, locations where ceremonies took place away from public view, where the most sacred objects were stored, where the most powerful rituals were performed. Some were simply storage, cool dry chambers where perishable goods could be kept safe from the heat and humidity of the surface. And some were something else entirely, their purpose unclear, their contents unknown, their connections to the larger site uncertain. The mainstream interpretation views these subterranean features as typical of Maya elite architecture, extensions of the practices seen at sites throughout the region. The Maya believed that caves and underground spaces were entrances to Xibalba, the underworld, the realm of the dead and the gods of death. Building temples over natural caves or creating artificial cave-like chambers beneath monuments allowed rulers to claim access to these powerful locations, to position themselves as intermediaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The passages beneath Yaxchilan would thus serve ritual and symbolic functions, their physical reality less important than their conceptual significance as gateways to another realm. Yet the extent of the underground network at Yaxchilan remains incompletely mapped. Explorers who have entered the passages describe chambers that open into further chambers, corridors that branch and branch again, spaces that seem larger than the surface structures above them would suggest. Some passages are blocked by collapse, centuries of earthquakes and tree roots and water infiltration, bringing down ceilings and filling corridors with debris. Some are simply too dangerous to enter, the air quality uncertain, the structural stability questionable, the risk of becoming lost in the darkness too great to justify the scientific value of exploration. What lies in these unreached spaces remains unknown. What was placed there by the ancient Maya, what rituals were performed there, what knowledge was preserved there, all of this persists beyond our current ability to discover. The preservation of organic materials in such environments presents particular puzzles. The Maya wrote extensively, their scribes producing books made from bark paper, their texts covering history and astronomy, ritual calendars and mythological narratives. These books, called codices, were enormously significant to Maya culture, repositories of knowledge accumulated across generations. Yet only 4 Maya codices survive today, all of them removed from their original contexts, all of them now housed in European museums, all of them fragmentary and damaged. The rest were destroyed, burned by Spanish missionaries who saw them as works of the devil, their contents irretrievably lost. The possibility that additional codices might survive in sealed chambers, protected from the humidity and insects and fungi that would normally destroy organic materials, continues to tantalize researchers. The underground spaces of sites like Yaxchilan, if they were ever used to store such materials, might contain texts that would revolutionize our understanding of Maya thought and history. We leave the river now, the boat's wake fading into the brown water, the forest closing behind us as if we had never been. The journey turns southward, crossing Guatemala into the flatlands of Bolivia, where the terrain changes utterly. The Llanos de Moxo spread across the eastern reaches of the country, a vast savanna that floods each rainy season, its grasses standing in water for months at a time, its wildlife adapting to cycles of inundation and desiccation. The landscape seems empty from the ground, a sea of grass stretching to every horizon, broken only by occasional forest islands that rise above the flood level. From the air, however, the emptiness reveals itself as illusion. the land bears marks of human modification on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. The spiral mounds of the Llanos de Moxos number in the thousands. They rise from the savanna in geometric patterns, their shapes clearly artificial, their placement clearly deliberate. Some are circular, some are rectangular, some trace spirals and zigzags across the landscape, their forms visible only from altitude, their purposes debated for decades. The channels that connect them stretch for kilometres, their beds below the surrounding terrain, their alignments suggesting networks designed to move water from place to place. The raised fields that cover hectares of seasonally flooded land demonstrate agricultural techniques that would have allowed year-round cultivation in an environment that might seem unsuited for intensive farming. The forest islands themselves, those patches of trees that dot the savanna, show evidence of human planting, their species composition different from natural forests, their presence marking locations where people lived and cultivated for centuries. The mainstream interpretation views these features as the work of pre-Columbian populations who developed sophisticated techniques for managing the challenging environment of the Llanos. The mounds provided elevated living spaces safe from annual floods. The channels managed water flow, draining some areas while irrigating others. The raised fields created planting surfaces above the waterline, allowing crops to grow even during the wet season. The system was ingenious, allowing dense populations to thrive in a landscape that, unmodified, would support only scattered groups of hunters and gatherers. The culture that built these features flourished for perhaps 1,000 years before the arrival of Europeans, its people adapting their land to their needs rather than adapting their needs to their land. Yet the scale of the Llanos earthworks challenges easy explanation. Estimates suggest that the modifications cover over 50,000 square kilometres, an area larger than some European countries. The labour required to move the millions of cubic metres of earth that these features represent would have required coordinated effort over generations. The engineering knowledge necessary to design effective water management systems over such vast areas would have required understanding of hydrology that we would call sophisticated by any standard. The social organisation needed to coordinate such efforts would have required political structures capable of directing labour, managing resources, and maintaining continuity across the decades required to complete major projects. The society that accomplished these things left no written records, no inscriptions, no identifiable royal tombs. We know what they built but not what they called themselves, how they organised their lives, what they believed about the world and their place in it. The spiral mounds present particular puzzles. Their forms are too regular to be natural, too consistent to be accidental. Yet their functions remain unclear. Were they ceremonial structures, their shapes carrying symbolic meaning now lost? Were they practical features, perhaps fish weirs or water control devices whose operation we do not understand? Were they boundary markers, territorial claims visible from great distances? Were they something else entirely, their purpose so foreign to our categories that we cannot even formulate the right questions? The spirals persist in the landscape, silent and geometric, their builders long vanished, their meanings waiting for someone capable of reading them. Standing in the Llanos de Moxos during the dry season, the grass brown and crackling underfoot, the mounds rising gentle and green against the horizon, one feels the presence of something vast and vanished. The people who shaped this landscape did not simply live here. They transformed here, remaking the savanna into something that served their purposes, engineering an environment rather than merely adapting to one. They did this without metal tools, without wheeled vehicles, without writing, without any of the technologies that we might consider prerequisites for civilization on this scale. They did it with labour and organisation and knowledge accumulated across generations, and then they disappeared, leaving behind only the marks of their presence, the geometry of their ambitions traced in earth and grass. The disease that came with the Europeans moved faster than the Europeans themselves. Smallpox and measles spread along trade routes, jumping from community to community, killing populations that had no immunity to pathogens evolved in the crowded cities of the Old World. Entire peoples may have died before ever seeing a European face, their numbers reduced by 90% or more, their social structures shattered, their knowledge systems disrupted beyond recovery. The survivors, those who lived through the waves of epidemic, found themselves in a transformed world. The old ways no longer worked. The old authorities no longer held power. The old knowledge no longer seemed relevant to survival in the chaos that followed. And so it was forgotten, lost in the struggle to persist, abandoned in the urgency of simply staying alive. This forgetting was not passive. It was not simply the natural fading of memory over time. It was active, driven by circumstances that made preservation impossible. The people who knew how to read the spiral mounds died before they could teach the next generation. The people who understood the water system perished before they could pass on their knowledge. The people who remembered what the builders had called themselves, what gods they worshipped, what stories they told, vanished into the demographic catastrophe that followed contact. What remains is silence, interrupted only by the shapes in the landscape, the geometry of loss. Our journey reaches now toward its close, the threads of our wandering beginning to weave together, the patterns of what we have encountered beginning to suggest meanings beyond the individual sites. From the leader-revealed megacities beneath the Amazon, where populations larger than medieval London managed landscapes larger than many European kingdoms, to the humid mysteries of Mosquitia, where the White City guards its secrets behind walls of vegetation and disease, from the unmapped pyramids of the Peten, where Maya kings built monuments to dynasties now forgotten, to the labyrinthine passages of Yaxchilan, where darkness holds whatever the ancient priests chose to preserve from light. From the spiral mounds of the Llanos de Moxos, where a civilization we cannot name reshaped the savannah to serve purposes we can only guess, the same themes recur: scale beyond expectation, sophistication beyond assumption, and loss so complete that only the stones remember what the people have forgotten. The forest that covers these sites is not indifferent. It participates in the forgetting, its roots breaking foundations, its leaves filling plazas, its growth obscuring what was meant to be seen. But it also participates in the preservation, its canopy shielding ruins from the worst of the tropical sun, its soil protecting artifacts from erosion and exposure. The forest is both destroyer and guardian, both the force that hides and the force that protects. The cities beneath the canopy persist precisely because the canopy is there, because the growth that conceals also conserves, because the wilderness that swallowed these places also saved them from the more systematic destruction that befell sites exposed to looters and developers and well-meaning archaeologists with inadequate methods. What did the builders know that we have forgotten? The question returns unanswered at every site. The precision of Maya stonework, the scale of Amazonian earthworks, the engineering of Bolivian water systems, the completeness of Mesquitian disappearance. Each site poses its own version of the same puzzle. How did people without our tools, without our technologies, without our accumulated scientific knowledge, accomplish things that we would struggle to replicate today? What methods did they use that left no trace in the archaeological record? What principles did they understand that we have not yet rediscovered? What was lost when their worlds ended, when the plagues came and the forests grew and the forgetting began? There are places where the ground remembers what the people forgot. There are places where the stones still hold the shapes of ancient hands. There are places where the forest, for all its patient growth, cannot entirely erase the marks of what came before. These places call to us across the centuries, across the chasm of the great dying, across the silence that separates their world from ours. They remind us that history is not a straight line from primitive past to sophisticated present. They remind us that knowledge can be lost as well as gained, that civilizations can fall as well as rise, that the darkness that swallowed these sites could one day swallow ours as well. The canopy closes overhead, green and dense and rustling with invisible life. Beneath it, the ruins wait. The terraces and plazas, the pyramids and mounds, the passages and chambers carved from living rock. They wait for the laser pulses that will map them, for the excavators who will uncover them, for the researchers who will interpret them. They wait for the questions we have not yet thought to ask, for the technologies we have not yet developed, for the understanding we have not yet achieved. They have been waiting for centuries, they can wait a little longer. But they are there, beneath the green, beneath the shadow, beneath the accumulated weight of forest and time. Cities that we are only beginning to see, civilizations that we are only beginning to understand, mysteries that we are only beginning to formulate, and somewhere in that darkness, in those chambers we have not entered, in those passages we have not mapped, in those sites we have not found, something persists, something the builders placed there, something they meant to endure. something that has survived the centuries of growth and decay, of collapse and reclamation, of forgetting and denial. What is it? What were they trying to preserve? What did they know that we need to learn? The forest keeps its counsel, and the stones say nothing. But the questions remain, hanging in the humid air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, waiting beneath the canopy